The recycled air on the Wanderer always carried a faint tang of copper and ozone, the scent of old wiring and tired filters that hadn't been replaced since before Cale Torn bought her. He sat slouched in the pilot's chair, one boot hooked, lazily on the edge of the console, sipping something his ship's AI insisted was coffee. It tasted more like the runoff from a starship's coolant system, but it was hot, and it kept his hands occupied. Docked beyond the viewport stretched the eternal black. Stars scattered like shattered glass, streaks of dust and faint nebulae whispering. Promises of riches to any fool desperate enough to chase them. Cale had been chasing those promises longer than he cared to count. Out here, on the frayed edges of civilized space, he could almost forget there'd ever been a time he answered to a uniform or a chain of command. He didn't notice the light at first. Just a subtle change in the rhythm of the ship's quiet. Hums and beeps, until a sharp ping cut through his thoughts. The AI's dry, clipped voice followed at once. "Captain, an automated beacon has just come online, bearing 27 Mark IV at a range of 70,000 kilometers. Repeating at 15-second intervals. Classification: distress." Cale sat up and squinted at the sensor display. A blinking red dot hovered against the darkness, steady and insistent. He toggled the audio channel, and the beacon's signal crackled into the cabin, an old Confederacy distress tone, harsh and jagged, followed by a string of coded data that scrolled across the screen. He frowned. Confederacy protocol, sure enough, but the ship it belonged to wasn't broadcasting. A name, only a string of numbers. He tapped a key and cycled the feed to visual sensors. The derelict emerged on his screen, a long dark silhouette with its running lights dead, drifting listlessly through space. Its hull was pitted and scorched, and the faint outlines of shattered viewports glinted faintly in the starlight. Cale leaned closer. The shape was unmistakable, prison transport class, older model, with heavy shielding around the aft cargo sections. He didn't even have to say it before the AI spoke again. "Captain, I must advise against this. Prison transports are universally regarded as poor salvage prospects. Statistically, 83% result in either legal entanglement, bodily harm, or significant repair costs. In colloquial terms, nothing but headaches and body counts." Cale let out a short laugh. "And yet here we are." His finger hovered over the thruster control. He knew what he was looking at. Dead ship, no lights, a signal that shouldn't even still be transmitting. It was the kind of wreck that promised just enough to get a man killed. But credits didn't come easy out here, and his luck hadn't exactly been shining lately. A prison ship meant reinforced plating, maybe valuable security systems. Hell, sometimes even classified tech if you were willing to risk it. Still, the way it sat there, dark and silent, gave him pause. The Confederacy didn't just abandon their ships. He glanced at the data feed again, frowning as something odd caught his eye. Below the standard distress code was a line of encrypted characters, pulsing faintly in crimson, separate from the rest of the transmission. Cale scrolled it into focus. Not Confederacy standard, not civilian. A biological hazard warning, that. Much he could tell from the symbol embedded in the string, but the encryption was too complex for his onboard tools to crack. That raised the hair on his arms. Biological hazard warnings were rare, and usually plastered all over the hull in bright yellow chevrons. This one? Subtle? Buried, and someone had gone to a lot of trouble to lock it down. He leaned back in his chair, weighing the silence of the void outside against the faint throb of the beacon. In the end, the math was always the same. Credits or nothing. All right, he muttered to himself, setting his mug down. He keyed the thrusters and felt the faint shudder of the Wanderer as she began to turn toward the wreck. Let's go see what kind of headache this one is. As the ship eased closer, The beacon continued to pulse, steady and quiet, like a heartbeat in the darkness. Asterisk, the Wanderer's docking clamps locked onto the derelict with a metallic groan. That rattled through the deck plates. Beyond the airlock, through a narrow viewport, the prison ship loomed like a carcass picked clean by the void. Her hull was scarred and split in places, paint stripped by micrometeors and years of neglect. Faint traces of scorch marks snaked across her skin, not from a fight, Cale thought, but something worse. The beacon was still wailing faintly through. His headset as he sealed his helmet and checked the readouts on his suit. He slid a fresh power cell into his pulse pistol and holstered it with practiced ease. "Any new data?" he asked, his voice distorted inside the helmet. The AI's reply was crisp, but there was something in its tone that unsettled him, the closest it ever came to hesitation. Additional scans reveal multiple hull breaches. Internal atmosphere minimal, but within survivable parameters. Power systems flickering at unpredictable intervals. Cale adjusted the sling on his shoulder and took one last sip of bitter coffee before stepping toward the airlock. "And the biological warning?" The AI paused. "The encryption is not only non-standard, Captain. It appears to rewrite itself every time I attempt to parse it. The nearest analog in my database describes it as adaptive." Cale stopped, his gloved hand resting on the release lever. "Adaptive? What does that mean?" "I do not know. I recommend caution and a loaded weapon." "Already ahead of you," he muttered, and pulled the lever. The airlock hissed open, and a thin mist rolled inside, air stale and cold, carrying a faint metallic tang that even his filters couldn't entirely block. He stepped across the threshold, boots clanging against the deck of the derelict, and froze as the sound echoed down the corridors unnaturally, as though the ship itself was holding its breath. The lights flickered as he moved forward, bathing the corridor in alternating darkness and harsh, sterile light. Prison ships all had the same layout, and yet something about this one felt wrong. The walls seemed to close in on him as he walked, his footsteps louder than they should have been, his own breath reverberating in his ears like a warning. The first bodies appeared after the third junction, a pair of guards in Confederacy uniforms, sprawled on the deck in pools of dark, dried blood. One had his helmet shattered inward, the other's visor was fogged with crimson and cracked. Their limbs were twisted at impossible angles, as though they'd been fighting each other with feral determination. He crouched, scanning their vitals, long dead. But what chilled him wasn't the carnage itself. It was their fingernails. They were stripped to the quick, broken, and bloodied, as though they'd been clawing at something, or each other. He straightened, exhaling slowly. "I'm seeing bodies," he vocalized. "Violent deaths. Something turned these people on each other." The AI's reply came back faint, garbled by interference. "Captain, sensors. Detect faint energy. Origin unknown. You should not linger." The cum crackled into static before cutting. "Out entirely." Cale's pulse quickened. He tapped the side of his helmet, but the connection stayed dead. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but instead he pressed on. He followed the trail of bodies deeper into the ship, noting how the violence seemed to intensify as he neared the center. Guards torn apart, prison doors ripped from their hinges, blood smeared in long, desperate streaks across the walls. And then the whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible over the faint whine of the emergency lights. He froze, turning slowly, but saw nothing. Human. There. Again. Clearer this time. The word hung in the air like a curse. His hand hovered near his pistol as he followed the sound to a massive security door half torn from its frame. Beyond it lay a cavernous hold. The temperature dropped noticeably as he stepped through. His breath fogged inside the helmet now, and the smell, even through the filters, was thick, organic, acrid. The hold was a cathedral of shadows and wreckage. At its center, against the far wall, something moved. Cale's hand instinctively tightened on his weapon as he approached. The figure resolved out of the gloom. A woman, chained to the wall by massive restraints that hissed and steamed. Where they met her skin. Her head was bowed, long black hair hiding her face. Her skin was not pale from oxygen deprivation, but shimmered faintly with a rich, unnatural blue, like twilight painted over flesh. As he stepped closer, she lifted her head, and he stopped. Dead, her eyes, molten gold, ancient and knowing, locked onto his. "You should not have come here," she whispered, her voice melodic, but edged with something feral. "Lucky for you, I'm bad at listening," Cale said, forcing calm into his voice, even as the air thickened around him. Her gaze flicked to his weapon and back to him. Then her lips parted in a faint, bitter smile. "Don't free me," she said, her words cutting the silence like a blade. He took another step closer, despite himself. "Why?" Her eyes flared, golden and terrible, and she leaned forward as far as the chains would allow. "Because," she breathed, "only the chains keep the monster inside." And for the first time in years, Cale felt something he thought he'd forgotten. Fear. The hold seemed to contract around him, the shadows deepening with each ragged breath he took. Cale's pulse pounded in his ears, loud enough to drown out the faint hum of the failing lights overhead. The woman's gaze, molten and alien, never left his face, even as faint wisps of vapor curled from the chains where they bit into her wrists and ankles. The oily substance coating the restraint sizzled and dripped to the floor, eating faint grooves into the steel deck with a soft, malicious hiss. He wanted to ask her 1,000 questions. Who she was, what she was, why this ship was full of corpses, with their own fingernails embedded in each other's flesh. But her eyes made him forget how to form the words. Instead, he forced himself to look away, scanning the room. The walls here bore different scars than the corridors he'd passed through, deep gouges in warped metal, as though something inside had tried to escape with monstrous strength. Behind him, the silence of the dead ship seemed to change. Not break, not yet, a shift. A faint thump echoed in the corridor beyond the security door, followed by another. The sound of boots on metal. Cale stiffened and spun toward the sound, weapon rising instinctively. He hadn't triggered any alarms. No, whoever they were, they'd been following the same beacon. The woman spoke again, soft but sharp, like glass cutting through cloth. "They're here." Cale turned back to her. "Who?" Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Predators. Hunters. The ones who chained me?" The words sent a chill down his spine. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, though there was no one else yet in sight. "Look," he muttered, "you clearly know more than I do. But if they're coming, and you want to live, now's the time to tell me what the hell you are." Her laugh, dry and hollow, carried no mirth. "I am what they made me," she said simply. "A mistake they couldn't unmake. A weapon they lost control of." She raised her chin slightly, letting the dim light catch on the slick blue sheen of her skin. "But even they fear what happens if the chains come off." Before he could reply, the faint thump of boots was joined by something else. Voices, low, guttural, and disciplined. They were speaking a language he didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakable. Orders, and then the lights went out. For an instant, the hold was consumed by darkness, so thick it felt like being swallowed whole. A soft, electric pop followed by the faint scent of ozone, and emergency lights stuttered to life, casting everything in blood-red relief. In that alien glow, he saw them at last. Figures moving at the edge of the corridor beyond the torn door. Sleek silhouettes, weapons raised, their armor black as obsidian and adorned with sigils that shimmered faintly in the crimson light. Their helmets gleamed, featureless and inhuman, their movements coordinated and silent. They advanced like a living shadow, one step at a time, their boots landing perfectly in sync. Cale's trigger finger itched, but he knew better than to fire. First, he counted 5, 6, no, 8 of them. Then, one figure emerged from behind the others, larger, slower, radiating authority. The helmet turned toward Cale, and a distorted, amplified voice emerged from somewhere deep inside. Cale. Torin, it said, pronouncing his name with clinical precision. His stomach dropped. I see you've found our property. Property. The word snapped something in him. She doesn't look like property to me. He called back, trying to keep his voice steady. The helmet tilted slightly, as though amused. You would not understand. Release the containment field and step away. And your death will be quick. Cale's eyes flicked to the woman. She didn't move. Her gaze remained locked on the leader, her golden eyes gleaming now, not just with exhaustion, but with something darker, a defiance that cut through them. Air like a blade. Cale tightened his grip on the pistol. Yeah, he said, just loud enough to carry. See, that's not really my style. For the first time, she smiled. Not bitter this time, but sharp, a smile full of teeth and warning. The soldiers advanced another step. Then she spoke again, her voice low enough he almost didn't hear. If you break the chains now, you die. If they take me, everyone dies. The chains hissed louder as if echoing her words, and that strange, musky scent, the one he'd noticed in the corridors, thickened in the air, sharp and electric. Cale's pulse quickened. He could feel something building, like the moment before a storm breaks. The leader raised a hand, and the soldiers leveled their weapons. The woman's golden eyes blazed. And then, impossibly, the ship began to breathe. The walls creaked and groaned, the deck vibrating beneath his feet, and that smell became a suffocating presence. The soldiers faltered, their formation breaking ever so slightly as their helmets fogged. Behind them, faint guttural screams began, distant at first, then closer. Cale glanced back at her just as she leaned forward against the chains, her voice, dropping to a whisper meant only for him. They've already lost, she said. And you should run. But he didn't move. He COULDN single quotes T, dot somewhere deep in his bones. He already knew the monster inside her was awake. The scream started in the walls, dot not from any throat. Not even from the soldiers now hesitating at the threshold, but from the ship itself. A low, keening wail, metal and wind, and something deeper, almost alive, echoing through the hold, rattling the chains, raising the hairs on the back of Cale's neck. The black-armored hunters stiffened as the sound rolled over them. Leader's helmet tilted fractionally, and though his voice stayed flat, Cale thought he heard something strain behind the modulation. Containment breach. The leader barked, raising 2 fingers. Deploy neutralizers. 2 soldiers broke formation, slinging rifles across their backs to produce canisters marked with jagged, unfamiliar glyphs. They stepped forward, moving fast, clearly trained, clearly used to this drill. But Cale could see it. Underneath the precision of their movements, a subtle hesitation, a flinch, a quickened breath fogging their visors. And he could see her, 2. The woman, Liana, though he still hadn't spoken her name aloud, raised her head higher, her golden eyes flaring in the red gloom. The chains hissed louder now, the oil, dripping faster, smoking as it struck the floor. The air felt thicker, charged. Each breath he drew was heavier, clinging to his lungs, and the faint musk, that impossible scent, was everywhere now. Captain, crackled the AI faintly through his helmet cone. Your vitals are irregular. Elevated pheromone concentration. Detected. Recommending immediate withdrawal. Cale ignored it. One of the soldiers approached Liana, leveling the canister at her chest dot, and then everything fell apart. The hunter froze mid-step, his gloved hand convulsing around the trigger. His helmet jerked toward his partner, not in communication, but in hostility. The second hunter stopped, tilting his head as if confused, then lunged, swinging the canister like a club, smashing it into the other's visor with a sickening crunch. The leader shouted something sharp in that guttural language, but it was too late. The two soldiers tore into each other, feral, wordless. Not just fighting, attacking. Biting through gloves, clawing at armor, beating each other down in a frenzy. The remaining soldiers staggered backward, their weapons lowering as confusion rippled through the unit. And still, Liana stared. Her eyes had darkened now to something molten and unholy, watching them with a detached, almost predatory calm. Cale raised his pistol, his hand steady despite the chaos, and took a single step toward her. What the hell are you doing to them? He demanded over the rising dim dot. Her answer was soft, but carried across the blood-soaked air between them. I am not doing anything, she said. They are. The two brawling soldiers had stopped moving, one crumpled, unmoving on the deck. The other crouched over him, helmet cracked, hands bloody. He slowly raised his head toward his leader, and then all of them moved. The remaining soldiers turned on each other at once. Rifles dropped as fists and blades came out. Perfect black. Formation dissolving into primal chaos. Screams rang out in the hold now, human and not, mingling with the groan of the ship around them. Even the leader faltered, one knee bending as he dragged a gloved hand across his visor, growling low and guttural as though wrestling himself inside. That armor-dot Cale didn't move. He stood rooted to the deck, watching as elite soldiers, creatures of discipline and control, became animals before his eyes. He felt it now. The weight in the air, the heat, the faint copper taste at the back of his throat. Whatever she carried inside her wasn't just seeping into the room, it was infecting it. And yet he still stood. His heart hammered, but his mind remained sharp, even as the smell curled into his lungs and the screams crescendoed. Finally, the leader staggered back into the wall, slamming a fist against his chest plate as though trying to ground himself. Neutralize her! He barked hoarsely, but his own men were already dead or tearing each other apart. Cale raised his voice, cutting through the chaos. You're losing, he called to him. The leader's helmet turned toward him, molten gold flashing faintly behind the visor now, a faint kinship to her eyes. She cannot be loosed, the leader rasped. And then the final chain snapped. The sound was unmistakable, metal, rending under impossible pressure. The restraint on her right wrist split and fell away, clanging against the floor with a burst of steam. Liana drew in a breath and stood, her full height commanding the space, hair tumbling wild around her. Shoulders. The broken shackle hissed at her feet, and the hunters froze. What was left of them, drawn by something they didn't even understand? Her voice, when it came, was not human anymore. It resonated in Cale's bones, low and melodic and wrong. You were right to fear me, she said. The leader raised his rifle one last time, but his hands betrayed him, shaking, unsteady. And then she moved. Cale didn't even see her cross the space. One heartbeat she was chained, the next she was in front of the leader, her hand gripping the front of his armor, dragging him off his feet like he weighed nothing at all. The others, what remained of them, collapsed to their knees, eyes wide and unseeing, their bodies twitching under whatever chemical storm she had unleashed. She leaned close to the leader's visor, her golden eyes glowing like molten metal. You thought the chains kept me inside, she whispered, her her voice, like a blade drawn across steel. But really, they kept you safe. The leader's visor spider-webbed with cracks as she let him drop, crumpled and motionless. For a long moment, the only sound was her breathing, slow, steady, and dangerous. Cale raised his pistol again, his finger hovering over the trigger, and her eyes flicked to him. For the first time, she looked afraid. "Don't," she whispered, softer now, almost pleading. "Don't what?" Cale asked, throat dry. Her gaze dropped to the floor, where the last chain, the one binding her left ankle, still glowed faintly, hissing and smoking. "Don't. Let me break this one," she said, her voice barely audible. "Because after that, I don't know who I'll be." And in that moment, with the walls of the ship groaning, corpses cooling at their feet, and the air heavy with something ancient and feral, Cale realized it wasn't the hunters, or even her, that terrified him most. It was the choice he would have to make next. The silence after the slaughter was heavier than the screams had been. The air in the hold shimmered, thick with that strange scent, metallic and sweet, alive and wrong, clinging to Cale's skin, even through the filters of his suit. His pulse pistol remained raised, though his hands ached from the effort of keeping it steady. Liana stood before him, still partially bound, her golden eyes dimmed now, but no less dangerous. The last chain glowed faintly at her ankle, the oily residue sizzling where it met the floor, and yet somehow it seemed stronger than all the others had been. Her hair clung to her face in damp strands, the black of it streaked with something that glowed faintly blue in the emergency lights. Her chest rose and fell as though she were catching her breath, but her posture was rigid. She didn't look at him or the dead soldiers. She looked at the chain. Cale swallowed. His voice felt foreign in the thick quiet. "You can stop it," he said. Her head tilted slightly, but she didn't meet his gaze. "No," she murmured. "No, not anymore. You can stop it. But if you don't—" Her hand flexed slowly, her long fingers curling into a fist. "Then it won't just be them next time. It will be everything." The words should have sounded like a threat. Instead, they sounded like grief. He kept the pistol trained on her, though his hands were shaking now. "Tell me why," he said. "Tell me what happens if I cut it." She finally raised her head, and for the first time he saw something behind the molten fury in her eyes. Fear, not of him, not of the soldiers, of herself. "When the last chain breaks," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "there is nothing left to keep the instincts contained. No chains, no suppressants, no reason. Just hunger. For violence, for dominance, for—" She choked on the words. "For blood." She took a shaky step forward, the chain grinding against the deck with a sound like bone scraping stone. Her shoulders shook, her control hanging by a thread so thin it was almost invisible. And yet, even knowing everything he'd already seen, part of Cale wanted to cut it anyway. Wanted to see what she looked like when nothing held her back. Behind him, the ship groaned again, but differently this time. The air shifted, a subtle pressure that made his stomach flip. The AI's voice finally crackled back to life in his earpiece. Faint and tinny. "Captain, long-range scans show multiple vessels inbound. Configuration, Cathar Purifier class. Estimate intercept, 19 minutes. Cale cursed under his breath. She closed her eyes, her lips forming silent words he couldn't hear. The hold felt smaller now, the walls closer, the weight of the air crushing down. Then she spoke aloud, sharp and bitter, each syllable a knife. "Do it then. Cut it. Better the galaxy burns by my hands than by theirs." Her eyes opened again, and this time they were brighter than he'd ever seen them. Gold rimmed with something darker, something ancient, something that didn't belong in a human. Galaxy. And that was when the ship answered. The lights overhead exploded, sparks raining down. The deck vibrated hard enough to knock him off balance, and every surface of the hold shimmered faintly with thin veins of blue light that pulsed in. Rhythm with her breath. Cale stumbled, steadying himself against the wall, and realized his pistol was no longer pointed at her. He'd lowered it without noticing. The corpses of the soldiers, the ones who'd torn each other apart minutes ago, twitched. Fingers curled. Helmets shifted with soft creaks. And then, in unison, they sat up. Their movements were jerky, but deliberate, puppets on invisible strings, their fogged visors glowing faintly gold now. Cale's breath caught. He backed up a step, then another. Liana raised her chin slightly, watching them without expression. "You see now," she said softly, though her voice carried perfectly in the chaos. "They don't chain me because I'm dangerous," she continued, her voice rising, stronger now. "They chain me because I wake things. In them, in the walls, in the air itself." She took another step closer, dragging the last chain behind her like a predator pulling its kill. "You can keep pretending you're in control, that you're just a man standing in a room making a choice. But you're not anymore." One of the soldiers, its neck bent at an impossible angle, black armor cracked and bloody, turned its ruined head toward him, and its voice came out layered with hers, impossibly deep, impossibly many. "The last chain is not hers to break. It is yours." Cale stared at the chain. His pulse raced. His throat tightened. Somewhere inside him, something whispered that maybe she was right, that maybe the galaxy deserved whatever she was. His knife was already in his hand, and as he crouched in front of her, her impossible golden eyes locked on his, the chain pulsed faintly in time with his heartbeat. Her voice softened again, only for him. "Choose. The monster they made me, or the monster I'll become." And in that moment, with the corpses rising around them, the walls bleeding light, and her scent thick as smoke in his lungs, he understood Dot. It had never really been about freeing her. Dot, it was about what she freed in him. The blade hovered just above the final chain, and for a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, everything else stopped. Cale's reflection wavered in the slick, blackened metal of the shackle, his eyes dark, jaw set, face drawn tight with something he couldn't name. The air in the hold had thickened to the point of suffocation. The scent of her, copper and smoke and something wild, coiling around his senses like a living thing. Her voice was no louder than her breath when she spoke. "Once you cut it," she murmured, "there's no undoing, no putting me back. You know that, don't you?" He met her gaze, golden fire and infinite weariness, and felt the faintest curl of a smile touch his lips. "Good," he said, "because neither of yous deserve a way back." The knife bit into the chain with a shriek of tearing alloy. Dot, and the world broke. The final link split in a rain of sparks, and for a second everything was blindingly, impossibly still, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Then she moved. It wasn't just her. The hold convulsed around them, walls bowing outward, deck plates shuddering underfoot, as if the ship itself was recoiling in terror. The corpses of the soldiers fell to their knees in unison, then rose, their visors glowing brighter, their bodies straightening into some eerie semblance of order. Liana inhaled sharply, and the lights above them blew out, plunging the room into darkness lit only by the strange veins of light now crawling across her skin. The scent in the air thickened, alive and electric, filling his lungs with a heat that burned and froze him all at once. She straightened slowly, and the chains slid from her wrists and ankles like snakes, clattering to the floor before melting into puddles of corrosive liquid. When she opened her eyes, they weren't gold anymore. They were black, endless black, flecked with faint stars, like the void itself had looked back at her too long and claimed her gaze as its own. The soldiers, or what was left of them, turned to him now, perfectly still, their movements no longer clumsy or feral, but graceful, terrifyingly precise. Liana raised her hand, and they stopped. Her voice was a whisper and a roar at once, layered and impossible to locate, filling the space like a storm pressed into a woman's frame. "You've done it," she said. "You chose." Cale kept his grip on the knife, though his fingers trembled. "What happens now?" He rasped Dot for the first time. She smiled, not bitter, not afraid, but something far worse. Now? Her gaze swept over him, through him, as though she could see the very atoms of his body vibrating in the dim light. "Now we choose." The walls of the hold flexed again, and this time they didn't stop. The faint hum of distant engines became a scream as the bulkheads groaned and tore like wet paper, revealing the void beyond. Yet no wind, no decompression followed. Instead, what poured through the widening cracks wasn't vacuum at all, but darkness, thick and crawling, studded with faint, glimmering points of light, like stars caught in. Targat had spilled into the room, coiling around her, then him, then the soldiers. As though claiming them, Cale's AI crackled frantically in his ear. "Captain, external sensors registering impossible readings. The ship is inside something. No known stellar phenomenon matches these parameters. Advise immediate." The feed cut off. Liana stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the deck, and when she stood before him, she reached out. Her fingers brushed the edge of his jaw, surprisingly warm despite everything, and her voice, softer now, slid into his ear. "You freed me," she whispered, "so I'll free you too." And suddenly, impossibly, he understood. Not words, not thoughts, but an understanding deeper than language. The chains hadn't just held her, they'd held at daughter. Them, the thing buried so deep inside her she barely dared breathe near it, and now it was awake. The soldiers straightened, in perfect synchronicity, and turned toward the breached hull, as though answering a silent command. One by one they stepped into the void beyond the ship. Their black forms swallowed without sound. Cale didn't move. Couldn, single quotes T. The darkness reached for him now, tendrils curling around his boots, his legs climbing toward his chest, and though every instinct screamed to flee, he found himself calm, because she was still holding his face in her hands. Her impossible eyes locked on his Dot, and in her gaze he saw a promise. "If you fall with me, you won't fall alone." Behind her, the universe cracked open wider, a hole in reality, cold and vast and somehow inviting. She smiled faintly, and together they stepped into it. There was no sensation of falling. There was no sensation of anything. One instant, the Wanderer's hold was tearing apart behind them, walls collapsing, alarms wailing, and reality bleeding at the seams, and the next, everything Cale had ever known simply stopped. No light, no sound, no air, and yet he was. At first, it was just darkness. Not the comforting black of space, but something thicker, oppressive, alive. The kind of dark that watched back. He couldn't see Liana anymore, but he could feel her. Her hands still wrapped around his, anchoring him in this void that felt infinite and crushing at once. Her voice reached him without sound, sliding directly into his mind like oil on water. "Don't let go." He tried to answer, but his throat wouldn't work. His lungs burned, yet there was no pain. Only the sensation that he was being unmade layer by layer. He caught a flash of her face then, not quite her as he'd seen her before, but something older. Her blue skin deepened to indigo, her hair whipped around her head like tendrils of shadow. Her golden eyes were gone entirely, replaced by endless black speckled with galaxies. And behind her, or through her, something stirred. Vast, silent, watching. It had no shape he could comprehend. Only the suggestion of motion. Patterns of stars collapsing and reforming, jaws and wings and eyes opening and closing in. Impossible geometries. It took Cale a moment to realize it was waiting. Not for her, for him. Her voice came again, quieter now, strained. The first time he'd heard fear in it since he'd met her. It's testing you, deciding. She turned fully toward him now, and the creature inside her bled into view. The faint silhouette of claws coiled behind her back, shadow wings unfurling around her shoulders, a crown of lightless thorns forming above her head. You freed. M-E, and it woke. The tendrils of darkness tightened around his ribs, sinking into his skin, not to harm him, but to read him, to measure what lay at the heart of him. He saw flashes of himself, bleeding in some forgotten trench, laughing drunkenly with dead comrades, firing into crowds when his superiors ordered him to, standing over the bodies afterward, and realizing, too late, what he'd become. And then he saw himself on the bridge of the Wanderer, hunched and tired and small. You could have walked away, she whispered into his mind, her black eyes boring into his. But you didn't. Something ancient moved in the darkness around them, not angry, not merciful, simply vast. Why? It wasn't her asking anymore. It was it. The question rattled his skull like a hammer, but somehow he found the strength to answer, not with words, because words were useless here, but with the memory of her face when he cut the final chain. The knowledge that whatever she was, however dangerous, she didn't deserve to be locked in a cage forever. The darkness shivered, and then the stars screamed. For a split second, he thought he was being torn apart, and maybe he was, but the pain never came. Instead, light erupted from somewhere deep inside Liana, burning through the dark like a blade of fire. The creature behind her recoiled, but didn't flee. It simply nodded. The tendrils unwound from him, withdrawing like a tide going. Out. Her voice came one last time, soft and full of something he'd never heard from her before. Gratitude. It accepts you. The black crown above her head flared, and the darkness folded itself back into her chest, shrinking down until she stood before him again, merely a woman, though no less dangerous for it. Around them, the void began to ripple, cracks of faint, light opening in its fabric. Shapes moved in the distance, impossible cities suspended in nothing, shattered moons with rivers of stars running through them, creatures the size of planets watching him with indifferent curiosity. And then the darkness spoke one final time, not in her voice, not even in sound, but directly into his soul. What is freed cannot be caged. What is chosen cannot be unchosen. You are ours now, human, and she is yours. The words branded themselves across his mind like fire. The light cracks widened, pulling them upward in a spiral of blinding brilliance. Cale squeezed her hand without thinking, and for the first time she squeezed back. Her smile was faint, tired, but real. And then the light swallowed them whole. When the world returned, they stood once more on the deck of the Wanderer, but outside the viewport, the stars were wrong. Every single one of them was watching. At first, Cale thought the Wanderer's systems were glitching. The stars outside the viewport shimmered like heat mirages, bending and pulsing, constellations twisting into configurations he didn't recognize. They flickered with faint golden threads crisscrossing the void like a web, and in each of those stars, he swore he saw a faint black pupil dilating, contracting, not watching, not passive, not distant. Watching him, Liana stood at the helm, her hand still resting against the console. Her golden skin was duller now, almost gray, but her presence filled the room like gravity. Her voice broke the silence, low but clear. This isn't your galaxy anymore. Cale tore his eyes from the stars, his hands tightening on the edge of the console. "What does that mean?" he demanded, though the words came out hoarse. Her head tilted slightly, her gaze lingering on the stars beyond. "The glass. You opened a door," she said softly. "I've been waiting for someone to do it. A human of all things. Brave enough, reckless enough, angry enough to cut the last chain." Her black-starred eyes flicked to his. "And now, they'll want to see what you can do." The words landed on him like a stone sinking through water. "What I can do?" She let out the faintest laugh. Not cruel this time, but something darker. Sad, almost fond. "You thought I was the weapon," she murmured, taking a slow step toward him. "But I was just the key." The lights on the Wanderer's control. Panels flared and died, one by one, until only the faint glow of the stars beyond illuminated the cabin. The golden threads outside began to move, slowly at first, then faster, coiling around the ship like snakes of light. And then they tightened. The hull groaned under the pressure, the metal around them vibrating as if caught in an invisible fist. Cale's instincts screamed to fight, to slam the thrusters, to do something. But the more the threads closed around them, the more he realized they weren't trying to crush the ship. They were dragging it. The stars outside slid past the viewport in impossible directions, space folding, curling inward. The Wanderer shot forward like a stone flung into a whirlpool of light and shadow, and Cale caught a glimpse of the void they were headed toward. Dot, it wasn't a planet. It wasn't even a station, Dot. It was a city, hanging in nothing, carved from obsidian and bone, vast beyond comprehension. Its towers twisting up into the black, its streets lined with shadows that moved and stared back at him, Dot, and at its center. A throne, Dot, empty, Dot, for now. The ship lurched, slammed down onto a platform of black stone with a soundless jolt that rattled his bones. For a moment there was silence, and then a voice, deep and resonant, not hers this time, spoke from everywhere and nowhere. "Come forward, human." Cale swallowed hard, his feet moving before his mind could catch up. Liana stayed behind, her expression unreadable, but he could feel her eyes on him as he descended the ramp alone. The air outside was thick, humming with energy that prickled against his skin. The city stretched in every direction, shapes, moving just at the edges of his vision, impossible creatures slipping through the streets like living shadows. The golden threads pulsed faintly in the ground, leading him forward, toward the throne. He reached it after what felt like hours. And yet no time at all. It towered above him, carved from a single black stone that seemed to drink in the faint light. Above it, a vast chasm of stars opened like an eye, and from within, the voice came again. "You broke the last chain." He forced his voice to work. I freed her." The laugh that followed was neither cruel nor kind, just vast. "You freed yourself." The throne flared with faint golden light. "And now the seat waits for you. Will you sit?" Cale glanced over his shoulder. Liana stood at the edge of the platform, her black streaked eyes watching, her expression taut, not with anger or hope, but with a strange kind of grief. "You don't have to," she called, her voice cracking faintly. "If you turn away now, you can still walk away. Back to the stars you knew. Back to the man you were." The golden light of the throne brightened, almost beckoning. But behind it, behind the seat, he could feel them. All of them. The ones who had been watching since he cut her chains. Waiting. If he sat, he knew he would never be just Cale Torrin again. The air hummed louder, the shadows circling closer. "Choose," the voice commanded. His hand hovered over the arm of Wa. The throne, and he closed his eyes, letting the darkness sink into his skin like a second heartbeat. When he opened them again, the shadows flinched, and he sat. The city erupted in light, the golden threads blazing through the streets, the creatures below bowing low, and the void above flaring as if in approval. Somewhere behind him, Liana whispered, though her words carried clearly through the roar. "You weren't meant to save me," she said. Her voice cracked. "You were meant to replace me." And as the black crown formed above his head, and the city roared his name in 1,000 voices at once, he finally understood what she'd meant. He hadn't freed the monster. He'd become it. Asterisk the throne was alive. It pulsed beneath him. A rhythm. Older than time. Older than stars. A heartbeat that wasn't his, and yet was becoming his. The black stone was warm under his hands, the golden veins across its arms sinking into his skin like roots, etching faint sigils into his flesh that glowed faintly every time he exhaled. Kale tried to move, but his body wouldn't. Obey. Above him, the void eye in the sky widened, swallowing constellations one by one as it stared down at him, impossibly vast. He felt its gaze not on his skin, but in his bones, as though it were reading the total sum of him. Every decision, every regret, every scar, and it liked what it saw. The golden threads that wound through the streets of the obsidian city flared with fresh light, and the shapes in the shadows, the watchers, began to emerge. They weren't just soldiers. They weren't just monsters. They were him. Hundreds, no, thousands of figures stepped forward from the dark, all wearing his face, each different. One with a ruined helmet from some war he barely remembered, one with eyes of burning coal, one with nothing but shadow where its features should be. Every choice he could have made, every life he might have lived, stared back at him, bowing low as the crown above his head burned brighter. And when they rose, their mouths moved in perfect unison, whispering a single word that was not quite a name, and not quite his, oath-bound. The sound of it rang through the stone beneath him, through his ribs, through his skull. And he felt it, deep inside, as if something ancient and titanic was coiling itself tighter around his. Soul. At the base of the platform, Liana still stood, though now she kept her distance. Her golden eyes were duller now, flecked with streaks of black that crawled outward like cracks in glass. She looked smaller somehow, and older, her shoulders hunched under an invisible weight. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft. City itself seemed to quiet just to hear it. "You've become what they wanted me to be," she said. Kale tore his eyes from the army of himself and fixed them on her. "And what was that?" Her bitter laugh was almost human again. "The fulcrum," she said. "The hand on the wheel. The one who decides which way the galaxy breaks." Her gaze darted upward, toward the void eye, then back to him. "And you've already started to. Feel it, haven't you?" He didn't answer, because she was right. Even now, he could feel the city's hunger curling at the edge of his thoughts, possibilities blossoming like fire. A thought, and somewhere far above, a star dimmed. Another thought, and one of the soldiers at the edge of the square crumpled to ash without a sound. The power didn't frighten him. That's what scared him. Liana stepped closer, her boots ringing on the stone. Her hair hung loose now, black waves veined with gold. "Do you know why the throne was empty?" she asked, her voice sharp now, cutting through the oppressive quiet. He shook his head, her eyes hardened. Because no one strong enough to claim it stayed human long enough to sit. The word human hit him like a punch. The golden threads flared brighter around the edges of the city, winding tighter around his wrists. Now, pulling faintly, urging him to let go, to sink into the throne entirely and become whatever it wanted him to be. One of the soldiers in the square, one of his other selves, turned its head toward him, its voice guttural, echoing, full of venom and awe. "You're already choosing. Even now, you've begun the harvest." "What harvest?" Kale demanded, though deep down he already knew. The soldier lifted a blackened finger, pointing toward the stars above, and the eye blinked. When it opened again, the stars had shifted, no longer random, no longer distant. Each of them was tethered now by faint golden threads, just like the ones that wound through the city, each star a point in an impossible web stretching across the galaxy dot, and one by one, those threads began to tighten. Faint pinpricks of light flared and then died as the stars winked out, collapsing silently under his gaze. The soldiers cheered, their many voices blending into a sound like roaring fire. Lyanna flinched. Cale looked down at his hands, his veins aglow with those same golden sigils, and for the first time, truly, he felt the weight of what he had become. "I didn't," he began, but the words faltered. Lyanna's voice cut through the din. "You think the throne asks permission?" she said bitterly. "It doesn't care what you meant, only what you are." A golden crown above his head flared again, blinding now as the soldiers in the square dropped to one knee in perfect unison. And the voice came again, deeper this time, louder, shaking the stones beneath his feet. "Oathbound, you have begun the great work. Now finish it." The city shuddered as the web of stars above tightened further, and somewhere in his chest, deep where no blade could reach, Cale felt something snap. He stood, taller now, his own shadow stretching across the square like the wings of some vast creature, and when he looked at his hands again, he no longer recognized them. They burned with light and blackness in equal measure. The soldiers rose, waiting for his command. The galaxy above wept light as the threads pulled tighter still, and Lyanna, for the first time since he'd met her, fell to her knees and whispered, "God help us all." The galaxy trembled. Above the throne, the great web of stars was no longer subtle. The golden threads stretched taut between every point of light in the night sky, veins of a living thing. The stars pulsed in rhythm with Cale's heartbeat, brightening when he inhaled, dimming when he exhaled. The soldiers, thousands of them, thousands of himself, each wearing a face twisted by some forgotten choice, filled the square below, their black visors raised now to reveal eyes that glowed like his own. They waited, silent but expectant, their hands resting on weapons that shimmered like forged starlight. The throne's arms seethed under his grip. The black stone cracked where his fingers pressed, and yet it held him there, as though molded. Around him, Cale Torrin had been here before, in a trench, hands bloody, waiting for an order to fire. On a bridge, watching refugees scatter under the guns of his ship. At the edge of another wreck, staring at her in her chains. Every time, someone else had handed him the trigger. But not this time. Above him, the voice of the void roared through. The air, the soundless force of it driving cracks across the obsidian square. "Oathbound, finish the harvest, claim your galaxy." The golden crown burned so brightly, now it seared the air. Drops of molten light falling from its edges and hissing against the black stones. And the threads tightened again. A star at the edge of the sky flared once, then blinked out, swallowed by the black, then another, and another. Each disappearance sent a surge of power through the throne and into him, lightning coursing through his veins, his bones ringing like struck iron. Below, the soldiers began to chant, low at first, then louder. "Oathbound, oathbound, oathbound." Lyanna rose from where she knelt, though her movements were slow, deliberate, heavy. She climbed the stairs toward him, each step ringing like a funeral bell. When she reached him, her hands curled into fists at her sides, and she stared at him, with eyes that no longer held fear, only sorrow. "Stop," she whispered. Her voice was so soft, he almost didn't hear it over the chant of the soldiers and the roar of the stars. But he did. He looked at her, his shadow now tall enough to swallow hers completely, and his voice, when it came, was quiet, but carried over all the noise, as though the galaxy itself wanted to hear it. Why? Her jaw trembled. Because you're not like them, she said. Not yet. You can still let go. You can still. But her words faltered when he raised his hand. The soldiers fell silent instantly, and with his fingers poised in the air, he could feel the web of stars between them, tight, quivering, begging to be plucked. One thought, and the galaxy would unravel. The throne thrummed under him, alive, hungry, whispering through the marrow of his bones. Do it, do it. He thought of the wars, the chains, the screaming wrecks full of bodies, the smell of copper, and regret that had followed him from battlefield to battlefield. And for the first time, he allowed himself to admit he wanted to burn it all. His fingers tightened, but Lyanna's hand shot forward and grabbed his wrist. And it hurt. Through all the light and the fire and the throne, her touch hurt. Her voice cracked, but she forced the words through. Don't let them turn you into me. The soldiers stirred, uneasy, the web of stars flickering as if unsure what to do. And in that moment, impossibly, he hesitated. The threads of light above him quivered, waiting, demanding. The voice of the void rose again, impatient and thunderous. Oath-bound, fulfill your purpose, unmake them. But the galaxy paused, because he did. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long, long time, he pictured something other than fire. A beach he'd once seen as a boy. A face he couldn't quite remember, laughing in the sun. The woman standing before him, blue skin slick, with tears she didn't even realize she was shedding. His grip loosened, and he stood up. The throne screamed under him as he pulled himself free, its golden veins tearing from his skin with an audible rip. The black crown cracked above his head, its molten light sputtering before dissolving into dust. The soldiers below roared in confusion, the web of stars above flickering violently as their commander walked away. He stepped down the stairs, past Lyanna, and into the square. The voice roared one last time, a final warning, a final promise. There is nitrogen monoxide going back. Cale stopped at the edge of the platform and looked up at the sky. The stars stared back, waiting, and for the first time he smiled, faint, tired, but real. Good, he said. Then he reached out, and with a single motion, he tore the threads from his own hands. The galaxy gasped, a sound like every star inhaling at once, and the web snapped, its golden light unraveling, streaking away into nothing. The soldiers dissolved into ash where they stood. The throne cracked and sank into the stone like molten glass. Above them, the eye in the void blinked and closed. The city fell silent, and Cale stood there alone with her, breathing hard, the scars of the throne still etched into his skin, but his eyes clear now. Lyanna stared at him, her mouth slightly open. You, she began, but couldn't finish. He turned to her, still, smiling faintly. No chains, he said softly. Then he offered her his hand, the same way he had on the wreck, what felt like a lifetime ago. This time she took it without hesitation. And above them, for the first time in memory, the stars began to shine without watching.